My name is Alyssa Morgan. I'm 28 years old, and in 3 days I was supposed to marry the man I thought was the love of my life, Nathaniel Harrington. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The dress was ready, the vineyard in Napa was reserved, and our friends had already begun flying in from both coasts. But behind the polished surface of wedding preparations, something darker was about to unfold, something that would test not just my relationship with Nathan, but the very core of who I am. Before I dive into what happened, let me pause for a second. If you enjoy stories where the so-called underdog refuses to be silenced and turns the tables on people who underestimate her, hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that strength isn't always loud. It's often hidden until the right moment. That Tuesday afternoon in Seattle had started like any other frantic wedding weekday. I'd been juggling final calls with the florist and making sure the photographer understood my vision for candid shots. When my phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Harrington, Nathan's mother, I expected some last-minute opinion about table linens or seating charts. Instead, her text was short and almost syrupy. "Alyssa, darling, I'd love for you to join me for tea this afternoon. Just us girls. Nathan has meetings all day, so it'll be nice to have time together before the wedding." I should have recognized the trap in those carefully chosen words, but exhaustion and the naive hope that maybe, just maybe, Margaret wanted to bond finally made me agree. By 4 o'clock, I was boarding a flight to San Francisco. It was barely a 2-hour trip, and I told myself I'd be back by morning, refreshed, maybe even closer to my future mother-in-law. The Harrington estate sat high in Pacific Heights, overlooking the bay with the kind of effortless grandeur only old money seems to carry. As my Uber pulled up the long driveway, I noticed another car parked near the front steps. Robert Harrington's black Tesla, gleaming like a warning sign in the afternoon light. My stomach tightened. Margaret hadn't mentioned Robert would be there. Inside, the housekeeper guided me not to the sunlit parlor where Margaret usually held court, but to the formal study, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy portraits of stern Harrington ancestors. Both Robert and Margaret were already seated, dressed not for tea, but as if heading into a corporate negotiation. Margaret's tailored navy suit seemed almost militaristic, while Robert's charcoal gray jacket looked as stiff as the expression on his face. "Alyssa, thank you for coming on such short notice," Margaret said, her smile polished but cold. I sat across from them, smoothing the hem of my dress, trying to ignore the way the silence in that room pressed against my chest. On the coffee table between us, instead of teacups, lay a thick leather portfolio. Robert didn't waste a second. "We thought it best to settle some business matters before the ceremony." His voice was clipped, practiced, the same tone he probably used in court. He slid the portfolio toward me. Margaret leaned in, her eyes glinting. "Every strong marriage begins with clear expectations, Alyssa. This," she tapped the folder, "is simply a formality." I opened it. My breath caught. Page after page of legal language, cold and precise, a prenuptial agreement, not a balanced one either. This document stated that if my marriage to Nathan ever failed, no matter the reason, no matter how long we had built a life together, I would leave with nothing. Any home, any investment, any growth during the marriage would default to Nathan. Even worse, buried in the fine print were clauses that could entangle my company, my intellectual property, the very work I had spent years pouring my soul into. I looked up, my throat tight. "This is the first time I'm hearing about a prenup." "Nathan understands the necessity," Margaret replied smoothly, almost triumphantly. "It's standard for our family. Assets of this magnitude require protection. Standard? Maybe for them. For me, it felt like a blade pressed to my throat." "And you expect me to sign this today?" My voice wavered, not with weakness, but with a fury I was forcing to stay contained. Robert clasped his hands. "The wedding is in 3 days. We need resolution now. If you choose not to sign, then regrettably the wedding cannot proceed." There it was, the ultimatum. Cold, absolute. Sign or lose Nathan. Sign or walk away humiliated. I gathered the papers with trembling hands, forcing myself to stay calm. Then I'll need to review this with my own attorney. Robert's eyes narrowed just slightly. Our family counsel prepared this. He's the best in San Francisco. The best for the Harringtons, I corrected. Not necessarily for me. For the first time that afternoon, Margaret's smile cracked. Alyssa, let's not be dramatic. Everyone signs these nowadays. It's practical. I rose slowly, clutching the folder like it weighed 100 pounds. Then you won't mind giving me until tomorrow to make my decision. Robert stood as well, buttoning his jacket. 9 a.m. sharp. With your signature, or we call off the ceremony. Their confidence was absolute, the arrogance in their eyes almost daring me to fight back. As I left the study, Margaret's voice floated after me, sharp as glass. She'll sign, Robert. Where else would she ever find a match like Nathan? I didn't wait to hear his answer. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I walked out, each step echoing louder than the last. By the time I reached the front gates, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the handle of the car door. I drove away from Pacific Heights with tears burning my eyes, the San Francisco skyline blurring outside the window. Somewhere above the fog, the life I thought I was stepping into was crumbling. But what the Harringtons didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that I was not the desperate girl they thought they could corner. And that realization was the ember that would soon ignite into fire. I barely remember how I made it back to my hotel that night. The folder with the Harringtons' ultimatum sat heavy in my bag, but heavier still was the weight of their words. She'll sign. Where else would she find a match like Nathan? That sentence didn't just sting. It cracked open something inside me. Because if they truly believed I was just a desperate schoolteacher's daughter clutching at their family fortune, then they had never really known me. And maybe that was my fault. I had spent years hiding parts of myself, letting people assume I was modest because I drove a sensible car and lived in a one-bedroom condo. But I wasn't modest. I was deliberate. And that part of me, the deliberate part, came from where I started. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, the eldest daughter of 2 high school teachers. My dad taught history, the kind of man who could make the American Revolution sound like a Netflix thriller. My mom taught English literature and insisted that every story we read had a lesson worth carrying. They didn't have much money, but what they did have, they poured into me and my younger brother, Noah. I still remember nights at our worn oak kitchen table, the 4 of us bent over homework. My dad with his coffee growing cold beside a stack of papers to grade, my mom reminding me to take breaks between problem sets. Discipline is good, sweetheart, she'd say, touching my arm gently, but don't confuse exhaustion with progress. Those words still echo whenever I feel myself burning out. We weren't wealthy, not by a long shot. Every vacation meant camping at state parks, not beach resorts. Every new school year meant scouring thrift shops for clothes that could pass for new. But what we lacked in luxury, we made up for in determination. If I wanted college, I'd need scholarships, and I knew it. I pushed harder than most kids my age. Late nights with AP textbooks stacked higher than my pillow, weekends spent at math competitions while my friends went to football games. By the time I graduated, I'd secured a full-ride scholarship to Stanford University, a miracle stamped with the letterhead of an admissions office in Palo Alto. Leaving Portland was like stepping into another universe. The campus was sprawling, bathed in California sunshine, filled with kids who casually dropped words like legacy and family foundation. I didn't fit their world, and yet I refused to be invisible. I buried myself in computer science, fascinated by how lines of code could become something tangible, something powerful enough to change how children learn. And then, during my senior year, my world shifted again. My grandfather, my mom's father, passed away. He'd lived a modest life, working as an engineer at a utility company, never flashy, always steady. He drove the same faded green pickup for 20 years and wore a Timex watch he'd bought before I was born. None of us expected much when he passed, so when the lawyer read his will and revealed he had left me $6.8 million in assets, the room went silent. Stocks, bonds, even some surprisingly lucrative real estate investments. He had built a fortune quietly, piece by piece, while living like an ordinary man. I remember clutching my mom's hand afterward. She whispered through her tears, "He believed in you, Alyssa. He always said you'd know what to do with it." Those words became a vow I carried with me. I didn't rush to spend it. I finished Stanford, graduated with honors, and moved north to Seattle, where the tech scene buzzed with energy and ambition. For months, I lived in a tiny apartment near Capitol Hill, coding through the night and living off instant ramen, even though I had millions in the bank. To outsiders, it looked like stubborn pride. To me, it was about proving I could stand on my own 2 feet, not on inherited wealth. Eventually, I poured a fraction of my grandfather's gift into a dream I'd been sketching since my sophomore year. LearnTech Labs. My company started small, just a few engineers in a rented co-working space, but our vision was huge. Educational software that didn't just drill kids with facts, but adapted to how they learned, meeting them where they were. By 26, we had secured contracts with several school districts in Washington state. My first round of outside funding valued us at over $2 million. The rest of the inheritance I invested carefully, diversifying across tech stocks, bonds, and even a few real estate properties in Seattle. Watching the numbers grow wasn't just about security. It was proof that I wasn't just the girl with scholarships anymore. I was building something lasting. Looking back now, I can see why I kept all this private. When you grow up as the kid with thrift store jeans and a classroom full of brand-name sneakers, you learn early how people's attitudes shift when they think you have money, or when they think you don't. I wanted love, friendship, and respect built on who I was, not on the size of my portfolio. But the Harringtons, they never asked who I was, they assumed. And assumptions are dangerous. Sitting in that hotel room, the prenup still burning a hole in my bag, I realized my silence had allowed them to write a false story about me. To them, I was disposable, a girl who should feel lucky to marry into their empire. The truth? I had an empire of my own, and it was time they learned. When I think back to those first months after launching LearnTech Labs, the memory feels like a blur of sleepless nights, coffee-stained notebooks, and half-eaten takeout containers. My world revolved around code, contracts, and convincing investors that education was worth betting on. Love wasn't on my radar, not until a night that changed everything. It was a fundraiser at the Seattle Art Museum, one of those evenings where people in cocktail dresses and tailored suits sip champagne while nodding at abstract paintings they don't really understand. I'd been invited because our company had donated licenses for schools in underserved districts. Honestly, I felt out of place. My black sheath dress was respectable but not designer, and my shoes pinched in a way that reminded me they weren't made for gala carpets. I was standing by a sculpture I couldn't name, balancing a glass of sparkling water, when I heard a low voice behind me. "Don't take this the wrong way, but you look like you'd rather be anywhere else." I turned, startled. The man facing me was tall, broad-shouldered, with warm brown eyes that held more mischief than arrogance. He wore a classic navy suit, but his tie was slightly loosened, like he'd fought a losing battle with formality. "Was I that obvious?" I asked, half embarrassed, half relieved someone had noticed. He smiled. "Only to someone who feels the same. Nathaniel Harrington." He extended his hand. I hesitated for a beat before shaking it. Harrington. The name carried weight in legal and social circles even I couldn't ignore. But his handshake wasn't arrogant. It was steady, warm. "Alyssa Morgan," I replied, "founder of LearnTech Labs." Recognition flickered across his face. "That's your company?" "My firm read about your pilot program in Tacoma. Impressive." It was rare for someone from his world to know about mine, rarer still for them to care. We fell into conversation, first about education, then about hiking trails, then about why neither of us could resist spicy Thai food, even if it meant regretting it later. What struck me most wasn't just what he said, but how he listened. When I spoke about the challenges schools faced, he leaned in, brows furrowed, asking thoughtful questions instead of offering shallow praise. By the end of the night, when he asked for my number, I didn't hesitate. Our first date wasn't a rooftop bar or five-star restaurant. Nathan suggested a picnic in Discovery Park, Seattle's largest green space. He showed up with a plaid blanket, homemade sandwiches that were slightly lopsided, and a thermos of coffee he claimed was his one real talent. I laughed so hard when he spilled mustard on his cuff that I forgot to be nervous. That day stretched into others. Weekend hikes in the Cascades, where he teased me for overpacking trail mix. Evenings in my tiny apartment where we attempted to cook, usually ending with burned pans and emergency pizza. Nights when debates about politics or literature ran until sunrise, leaving us bleary-eyed but unwilling to stop talking. He never flaunted his family's wealth. In fact, if anything, he seemed intent on distancing himself from it. "I'm the youngest," he once told me as we walked along the pier, the salty wind tangling my hair. "My siblings are perfectly content inheriting the firm and the legacy. I just want to build something of my own." I remember pausing, studying him in the glow of the streetlights. "Then maybe we're not so different," I said quietly. Of course, the differences were still there. I hadn't told him about my inheritance or the true scope of my finances. To Nathan, I was the driven entrepreneur who lived in a modest condo and drove a used Subaru. He seemed to like that version of me, the woman who wasn't dazzled by his last name or intimidated by his connections. There were moments, though, when the shadow of his family crept in. I met his older brother briefly at a networking event in San Francisco, and the way he sized me up in a single glance made my skin prickle. Once, over dinner, Nathan mentioned his mother in passing, a vague, "Mom can be particular." I didn't press. At the time, I didn't want to, because when it was just the two of us, none of that mattered. The night he told me he loved me, we were on the rooftop of my apartment building, wrapped in a blanket against the chill. The city lights glittered like constellations beneath us. "I know I don't say things easily," he admitted, eyes fixed on the skyline. "But with you, Alyssa, I feel grounded, like I don't have to prove anything." My throat tightened. I thought of the girl I'd been, the one with thrift store clothes and scholarship dreams, and how far I'd come. And yet, with Nathan's arm around me, I felt seen in a way I hadn't expected. "I love you too," I whispered, the words slipping out like they'd been waiting all along. He kissed me then, gentle at first, then with a fierceness that promised more than just passion. It promised partnership. If only I had known then how fragile that promise could be. Because love, no matter how pure, doesn't always silence the voices of family legacies and old money, and soon I would learn just how loud those voices could be. When Nathan first suggested I meet his parents, my stomach twisted into knots. By then, nearly 6 months had passed since our first date, and things between us had deepened in a way that left little doubt we were serious. Still, the Harringtons weren't just any family. They were a dynasty. Old San Francisco money. A law firm that had its fingerprints on half the Fortune 500. I tried to reassure myself on the flight down from Seattle. They'll see what Nathan sees in me. They'll understand. But as the city came into view, fog spilling over the Golden Gate, the glitter of lights stretching across the bay, I couldn't shake the feeling I was walking into an interview, not a dinner. The Harrington estate sat in Pacific Heights, perched on a hill where every house looked like it had been plucked from the cover of an architecture magazine. Their mansion was no exception. Ivory stone, towering windows, a wrought iron gate that opened with silent precision as our car approached. Nathan squeezed my hand as we walked up the steps. "Just be yourself," he whispered. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one under a microscope. The front door opened before we knocked. A uniformed housekeeper greeted us with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She led us through a marble foyer into a dining room that looked more like a boardroom than a place to eat. Long mahogany table, chandelier dripping crystal, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching us like silent judges. "Darling," Margaret Harrington swept in, air-kissing Nathan's cheek before turning to me. She was tall, elegant, every hair in place, her diamond necklace catching the light. Her smile at me was polished but cool. "So this is Alyssa," she said, as though unveiling a curiosity. Nathan's told us. Bits and pieces. Bits and pieces. My cheeks flushed, but I forced a polite smile. It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Harrington. Margaret, please, she corrected smoothly, then gestured toward the man who had just entered, Robert Harrington. His handshake was firm, his gaze sharp. Robert, he introduced himself, though everyone in the Bay Area already knew who he was. Dinner began with impeccable service, courses arriving like clockwork, each plate a piece of art. But the conversation? That was another story. So, Alyssa, Margaret began, delicately cutting into her salmon. Nathan tells us your parents are teachers? Yes, I said. High school teachers back in Portland. My dad taught history, my mom English. How admirable, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Such important professions, though I imagine not the easiest, financially speaking. I tightened my grip on the fork. They taught me the value of hard work and integrity. I couldn't have asked for better role models. Robert interjected, turning to Nathan as though I weren't there. Remind me, which firm represents her startup? Surely not one of the larger players yet? I set my fork down. We've worked with a boutique firm in Seattle, I said evenly. They specialize in tech contracts. It's been a good fit. He nodded politely, but with that same dismissive glint in his eyes, as though I'd confirmed his suspicion. Small time. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. Every question Margaret asked had a barb beneath it. You went to Stanford on scholarship, didn't you? She asked, her tone honeyed but sharp. Yes, full ride. How resourceful, she murmured, sipping her wine. I do hope the program was comprehensive. By dessert, I felt as though I'd been dissected and filed neatly under acceptable but unimpressive. Nathan tried to steer the conversation, praising my company's work with underfunded schools, but his parents barely responded. What cut deepest wasn't their skepticism, it was their assumption. That I should be grateful for a seat at their table, grateful their son had chosen me. They didn't see me. They saw a resume that didn't match their pedigree. After dinner, when the housekeeper showed me to the powder room, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My lipstick had faded, my smile felt brittle, and behind my eyes, a storm was brewing. For a moment, I wanted to run, to call a cab, book the next flight back to Seattle, and never look back. But then Nathan appeared at my side, touching my arm gently. Hey, he whispered, his voice low so his parents wouldn't hear. I know they can be intense. But I see you, Alyssa, and I love what I see. The sincerity in his eyes steadied me, even as the weight of his family's judgment pressed down. I nodded, swallowing hard. I just hope they'll learn to. He kissed my temples softly. They will, in time. I wanted to believe him. I really did. Walking out of that mansion later that night, the fog curling around the street lamps, I couldn't shake the unease coiling in my chest. Nathan's love felt real, unshakable. But his parents' eyes had told me a different story, one where I'd always be an outsider, tolerated but not embraced. I didn't know then how much their assumptions would cost me, or how soon they would weaponize them. The night I left the Harrington estate, fog wrapping the city in its cold arms, I told myself one dinner didn't define an entire future. Nathan wasn't his parents. He saw me, loved me, and in the quiet between us, I felt safe. I clung to that thought, even as their judgment lingered like smoke in my lungs. A few weeks later, he proved just how serious he was. Nathan invited me to dinner, saying only, "Dress warmly, it's a surprise." I met him on the San Francisco pier, where a small yacht waited, its lights glowing against the dark water. My breath caught. "You rented this?" I asked, eyes wide. He grinned, taking my hand. "Borrowed. A friend owed me a favor." As we sailed out into the bay, the city shimmered behind us, the Golden Gate a silhouette against the fading light. The air was cool, the waves gentle. Nathan poured us glasses of champagne, though my nerves made me barely sip mine. Halfway across the water, he led me to the bow. The city lights danced in his eyes as he pulled a small velvet box from his jacket. "Alyssa," he began, voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard before. "Before you, I thought love was something other people found. I thought commitment was just another word for contracts, but with you, I finally understand what it means to build a life together." My heart thudded in my chest. He dropped to one knee. The world seemed to still, the slap of waves against the hull, the distant cry of gulls, even my own breath. "Will you marry me?" he asked, opening the box to reveal a vintage emerald ring. "It was my grandmother's. She wore it for 50 years. I can't imagine anyone more worthy of it than you." Tears blurred my vision as I nodded. "Yes, Nathan. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and the stone caught the moonlight like it had been waiting for that moment all its life. He stood, pulled me into his arms, and kissed me as the city sparkled behind us. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine forever. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. We agreed the ceremony would be held in Napa Valley, surrounded by rolling vineyards and sunlit hills. Nathan said it was a place his family cherished for generations, and though I might have chosen something simpler, I didn't protest. I wanted this day to feel like ours, even if the setting leaned more Harrington than Morgan. At first, planning felt like a dream. We toured vineyards, sampled menus, and laughed over cake tastings when Nathan insisted on chocolate while I leaned toward lemon. But slowly, Margaret's presence began to seep into every decision. She had a way of phrasing suggestions as commands. 50 additional guests from our circle, of course. These are people Nathan grew up with. It would be rude not to include them. "Darling, the cake you chose is charming, but a 7-tier design from La Pâtisserie is more appropriate for an event of this stature." I bit my tongue, letting the comments slide. Did I really care about cake flavors or guest lists? Not compared to marrying the man I loved. But the cuts added up. One evening, as we flipped through fabric swatches for bridesmaid dresses, Margaret ran her manicured fingers across the one I liked. "Simple. Economical," she murmured, then looked up with a smile too sharp to be kind. "It suits you." Heat rose to my cheeks, but I forced a polite laugh. Sometimes less is more. Nathan, bless him, tried to mediate. "Mom, it's Alyssa's wedding too. Her voice matters." "Of course it does," Margaret replied sweetly, though her eyes told another story. The only hill I refused to surrender was my dress. I'd chosen a sleek, modern design from a small Seattle boutique. Clean lines, nothing extravagant, but it made me feel beautiful in a way no ball gown could. When Margaret saw it during a fitting, she arched an eyebrow. "Interesting choice. Sting. Budget-friendly, I assume." I smiled, though my grip on the fabric tightened. "No, just the one that feels like me." Her silence spoke louder than words. Through it all, I tried to hold on to the bigger picture. Once we're married, it'll just be Nathan and me. We'll build our own life, our own traditions. His parents won't define us. I told myself that again and again, even as each compromise chipped away at me. Nathan kissed my temple one night after yet another argument over the guest list. 3 more weeks, he whispered. "Then we'll be free of all this noise." I clung to his promise, but deep down, unease still coiled in my chest. Because I'd already seen how loudly the Harringtons could speak. And I was starting to wonder, would their voices ever really fade? 3 days before the wedding, when the vineyard flowers were already ordered and my dress hung waiting in a Napa boutique, I received a text from Margaret Harrington. "Alyssa, darling, come for tea this afternoon, just the 2 of us. Nathan will be in meetings, but it would be lovely to have some time together before the big day." Her words looked harmless, even warm, glowing on my phone screen. Maybe, I thought, this was her olive branch. Maybe she wanted to finally accept me, to show she cared. Against the warning prickle in my chest, I agreed. By early afternoon, I was pulling up the Harringtons' circular driveway in San Francisco, the estate glowing under a pale sun. My modest Audi felt out of place next to the sleek Mercedes parked out front. My breath hitched. Robert Harrington's car. Margaret hadn't mentioned he would be there. I told myself it was nothing. I smoothed my skirt, lifted my chin, and rang the bell. The housekeeper, impeccably polite, led me not to the sunroom where Margaret usually entertained, but to the formal study, a dark, wood-paneled room where light seemed to falter beneath the weight of portraits and legal tomes. Already seated were Margaret and Robert, side by side, dressed as though for a courtroom rather than afternoon tea. "Sweetheart?" Margaret greeted, her smile thin as parchment. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, sit." I lowered myself onto the chair across from them, the polished leather cold beneath me. On the table between us sat an untouched tea service and, more tellingly, a leather-bound portfolio. Robert leaned forward, clasping his hands. We felt it important to discuss some matters before the ceremony. Business matters. His tone was clipped, rehearsed. Margaret added, "Every successful marriage begins with clear expectations." Her hand drifted to the folder, tapping it once like a gavel. My stomach tightened. "What kind of expectations?" Robert slid the portfolio across the table. "A prenuptial agreement. Standard language. It protects the family assets and ensures clarity should the marriage not succeed." I stared at it, unmoving. "A prenup? Now? This is the first I'm hearing of it," I said, voice sharper than I intended. "Nathan understands the necessity," Margaret interjected smoothly. "It's tradition. Every spouse who joins this family signs one." Tradition. As if marriage were just another business merger. Finally, I opened this folder. My pulse drummed as I scanned the dense text. The more I read, the colder I felt. The terms were brutal. In the event of divorce, no matter how long we were married, I would leave with nothing. Any property, any financial gains, Nathan's by default. Worse, tucked deep in the clauses were provisions that could threaten my company's intellectual property, tying my life's work to their family. I set the folder down carefully, though my hands trembled. "This seems extremely one-sided." Robert waved a dismissive hand. "It's boilerplate. Our counsel is one of the best in San Francisco." "The best for the Harringtons," I shot back. "Not necessarily for me." Margaret's smile stiffened. "Darling, there's no need for dramatics. Everyone signs these nowadays. It's practical." "Then you won't mind if I have my attorney review it," I said, keeping my tone even though my throat burned. Their eyes flickered. Robert's brows lifted, his voice hardening. "Your attorney? That isn't necessary. We need this resolved today." "Today?" My voice cracked, then steadied. "You're saying the wedding depends on me signing this document right now without counsel?" Margaret leaned forward, her smile icy. "What we are saying is that if you truly love Nathan, you'll understand. Sign it, and everything continues as planned. Refuse, and the wedding cannot proceed." The words slammed into me like a physical blow. I rose, gripping the folder as if it anchored me. "Then I'll speak to Nathan before making any decision." "He knows," Margaret said lightly, as if swatting away my protest. "He simply didn't want to upset you before the festivities." That stung worse than anything, the idea that Nathan had known and let me walk blind into this trap. Robert stood too, buttoning his jacket. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Your signature, or we cancel the wedding. That is the bottom line." Margaret's voice followed as I turned toward the door, each syllable a blade. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Alyssa. Matches like Nathan don't come along twice." I walked out stiffly, every step echoing in the cavernous hallway. Only once I slid into my car did the dam break. Tears blurred the world as I gripped the steering wheel. Their arrogance, their certainty that I would cave, it shredded something inside me. But beneath the hurt, a spark ignited. They thought I was powerless, a girl with nothing to her name. They couldn't have been more wrong. As I drove back toward the city, the folder heavy on the passenger seat, one thought kept pounding in my head. They want to play this as a business deal? Fine. Then it's time they learned who they were really dealing with. I don't remember much of the drive back from Pacific Heights. Just streetlights smearing into streaks of gold as tears clouded my vision. By the time I reached my hotel in downtown San Francisco, my body felt hollow, as if the Harringtons had carved out the part of me that still believed this marriage could be simple. The folder with the prenup sat on the bed like a silent accusation. I couldn't bear to open it again. My phone buzzed. Nathan. 4 missed calls. I let it ring once more before swiping it away. I needed a voice that wasn't his. I dialed Chloe. She answered on the second ring. Alyssa? It's midnight. Are you okay? The moment I heard her voice, my composure cracked. They ambushed me, Chloe. 3 days before the wedding, they threw a prenup in my face and said, "Sign it or it's off." I could practically hear her sit up in bed. Are you kidding me? That's not just tacky, that's manipulative. And Nathan, my throat tightened. They said he knew. Silence, then a sharp inhale. Did he? Did he actually know? I don't know anymore. If he didn't, then his parents are controlling this wedding more than he is. And if he did, my voice broke. Then he let them humiliate me. Her outrage burned through the line. That's not love, Alyssa. At least not the kind you deserve. What are you going to do? I pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes. I don't know. I can't sign it, Chloe. Not like this. Not without destroying myself. Then don't, she said firmly. Call your lawyer. You have leverage. You're not powerless. I wanted to believe her, but all I felt was the sting of betrayal, twisting deeper each time Nathan's name flashed on my phone. By morning, I couldn't avoid him any longer. He was waiting outside my hotel, leaning against his car, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Alyssa, he said the moment I stepped out, voice raw. Please, talk to me. I crossed my arms over my chest, the prenup folder clutched against my side. You knew. His face tightened. I knew they'd bring up a prenup, yes, but not like this. Not cornering you without me there. That's supposed to make me feel better? My voice rose, sharp with hurt. 3 days before our wedding, Nathan, and you left it to your parents, like I'm some problem they needed to manage. He flinched, then reached for me. I was trying to protect you from the stress. I thought, protect me? I laughed bitterly, pulling back. By letting them spring an ultimatum that could wipe out my company? That's not protection, Nathan. That's cowardice. For a moment, anger flickered across his face. You're overreacting. It's just a legal formality. Every Harrington marriage has one. My chest constricted. So this is what marriage means to your family? A contract where I get nothing, even if I spend years building a life with you? He hesitated, and the pause was damning. I pressed harder. Did you even read it? His silence told me the truth before his words did. Not in detail. Dad said it was standard. I shoved the folder into his chest. Then read it, section 4, paragraph 3, and then tell me it's standard. He opened it, flipping through quickly, his brow furrowing as he read. When his eyes lifted to mine, there was a trace of unease. This language is harsher than I expected. They gave me until 9 a.m. tomorrow, I said, my voice shaking. Sign or the wedding's canceled. That's the position they put me in. Where do you stand, Nathan? His jaw worked, torn between two loyalties. The wedding isn't contingent on this. We'll work it out. Then tell your parents that, I shot back. Call them right now. Tell them their ultimatum is off the table. He shifted, rubbed the back of his neck. Be reasonable. We can't just dismiss this entirely. A prenup makes sense, given the circumstances. The circumstances being your family has money and I don't? That's not what I said. No, I whispered, my chest aching. But it's what you meant. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I need time, I said finally. And you need to decide who you're standing with, me or them. Alyssa, I turned, cutting him off. No, don't say you love me unless you mean it enough to fight for me. I walked back inside before he could respond, my heart pounding, my ring suddenly feeling heavier than the emerald stone should allow. Alone in my hotel room, I stared at the city skyline through the glass. Doubt gnawed at me, sharper than any insult Margaret had thrown my way. If Nathan couldn't shield me now, before the vows were even spoken, what kind of future could we really have? For the first time since saying yes on that yacht, I wasn't sure if forever with Nathan was still something I wanted. The night after my confrontation with Nathan, I barely slept. The hotel room felt more like a cell than a refuge. 4 walls pressing in, shadows whispering doubts I didn't want to hear. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret's cold smile and the sharp edge of the contract shoved across the table, and worse, Nathan's hesitation. By dawn, the tears had dried. What remained wasn't despair anymore, it was resolve. If the Harringtons thought I would fold under pressure, they didn't know me at all. I called Chloe first. "I need a lawyer," I said without preamble. "You've got one," she replied. "Remember Henry Collins? Your dad used him for that zoning battle years ago. He's still practicing. Office in San Francisco now. Want me to connect you?" "Yes," I breathed. "Please." Within the hour, Henry himself returned my call. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that anchors you when the ground feels shaky. "I read your message," he said. "Meet me at my office. Bring the document. Don't sign a thing until we talk." His office was in the financial district, a sleek high-rise with floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the bay. The kind of place that reminded you of power. Not loud, but quiet, deliberate. Henry was older now, gray at the temples, but his handshake was firm, his gaze sharp. He gestured for me to sit, then unfolded the prenup on his desk as though handling evidence at a trial. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. The ambush, the ultimatum, the way Nathan stood silent when I begged him to choose. My voice trembled at first, but with each word the anger steadied me. Henry listened without interruption, then slid his reading glasses higher on his nose and began scanning the pages. His frown deepened with each line. Finally, he set it down. "This isn't a standard prenup, Alyssa. It's a weapon." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" He tapped a paragraph near the middle. "This clause strips you of rights to any shared assets, even those you contribute to directly. Your salary, your company's growth. If you used that income toward your life with Nathan, it would still revert to his family in the event of divorce. In short, they want you dependent and disposable." The words landed like a punch, but also like a spark. At least now the injustice had a name. I leaned forward. "Can we fight it?" A thin smile touched his lips. "Of course. But first, you need to decide what fight you're in. Is this about protecting yourself or proving you're not a pawn in their game?" "Both," I thought. But I only said, "I won't be bullied. Not by them, not by anyone." He nodded. "Good. Then we play offense. I'll draft a counterproposal. One that safeguards your company, your income, and any marital contributions. It will be ironclad. If the Harringtons refuse, we'll make it clear that pushing this any further risks public exposure. Their reputation is their crown jewel, Alyssa. They won't gamble with it." For the first time in days, a flicker of control returned to me. When I left Henry's office, the city looked different. The skyscrapers no longer loomed. They stood like allies, silent witnesses to my resolve. I called Chloe again as I walked toward the Embarcadero. "Well?" she demanded. "I'm not signing," I said, my voice steady. "Henry's drawing up a counter-contract. If Nathan's serious about us, he'll stand with me. If not—" I paused, staring at the glittering water. "Then at least I'll know before I waste vows on someone who won't fight for me." Chloe exhaled, a mix of relief and pride. "That's my girl, finally fighting fire with fire." That evening, Nathan texted, begging to talk. For once, I didn't rush to answer. I let him sweat. Instead, I sat by the hotel window with Henry's notes spread out before me, emerald ring glinting under the lamplight. For weeks, I'd worn it as a symbol of hope. Tonight, it felt like a challenge. I whispered to myself, as much a promise as a vow. They wanted me weak, but they just handed me the reason to be stronger. The Harringtons had underestimated me. They thought I was just a girl from Seattle lucky enough to catch their son's eye. But what they didn't see was the grit that built my business, the fire that carried me through every storm. And now, They were about to learn exactly who they were dealing with. Nathan chose the restaurant. Of course he did. A polished, candlelit place in the Marina District with white tablecloths and waiters who floated instead of walked. The kind of setting that was supposed to soften tempers, make problems disappear under the hum of soft jazz and the clink of wine glasses. But as I slid into the booth across from him, I wasn't here to be soothed. Nathan looked tired, like he hadn't slept either. His cufflinks gleamed under the low light, but his eyes darted nervously, as though the mahogany walls might overhear us. "Alyssa," he started, his voice soft, rehearsed. "Thank you for coming. God, I hate how things went down. I never wanted you to feel cornered." I folded my napkin slowly across my lap, steadying myself. "Cornered? Nathan, your family ambushed me with a contract that stripped me of everything I've worked for. That's not a misunderstanding. That's betrayal." His jaw clenched. He reached across the table, palm open, but I didn't move. "They just want to protect me. Protect what they've built," he said, as if repeating a line drilled into him since childhood. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Protect you or control you? Because from where I'm sitting, Nathan, it looks like they don't trust you enough to make your own choices. And worse, they don't respect me enough to see me as your equal." The waiter approached, menus in hand, but Nathan waved him away. The tension at our table was a wall no one wanted to walk through. He exhaled hard. "You don't understand how ruthless they can be. I was trying to buy us time." "Time?" My laugh was sharp, startling even to me. "You stood there and watched them humiliate me. You didn't push back. You didn't even say my name." His shoulders sagged, as though the weight of his silence that day had finally caught up with him. I froze, Alyssa. I was afraid of losing both you and them. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe the storm would pass. I shook my head slowly. Silence isn't neutral, Nathan. Silence sides with the one holding the weapon. The words hung between us. For once, he didn't argue. He just stared at me, as if finally realizing that love wasn't a shield he could hide behind. It was a choice, one he hadn't made when it counted. The waiter returned, setting down 2 glasses of red wine Nathan must have ordered earlier. I wrapped my fingers around the stem, not drinking, just grounding myself in the cool glass. I met with Henry Collins, I said. He reviewed the contract. He called it a weapon. Do you know what that means? Your family didn't just want to safeguard assets. They wanted to erase my worth, to make sure if I ever stood against them, I'd have nothing. Nathan's eyes widened. You talked to Henry? Yes, and he's drafting a counterproposal, one that protects me and what I've built. If you're serious about marrying me, you'll support it. If not, I paused, letting the silence sharpen like a blade. Then at least I'll know where you stand. He swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing. Do you realize what you're asking me to do? Going against them could cost me everything. Everything? I leaned closer. Nathan, if standing up for us costs you their money, their approval, then maybe it's time you ask yourself what's worth more. Your inheritance, or the woman you claim to love. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the wine, then set it down untouched. For a moment the mask slipped, and I saw the boy beneath the Harrington air. The boy desperate to please, desperate not to be cast out. I do love you, he whispered. More than anything, I don't know if I'm strong enough. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't let the tears come. Not here, not now. Then find your strength, I said firmly. Because I won't walk into a marriage where I'm treated as less. I deserve a partner, not a spectator. Silence stretched, filled only by the distant murmur of other tables. Nathan stared at me, torn between fear and devotion, privilege and love. Finally, he nodded, almost imperceptibly. Send me the counterproposal. I'll read it. I'll try. Trying isn't enough, I replied, but it's a start. I stood, leaving the wine untouched, napkin folded neatly on the table. As I walked out into the cool San Francisco night, the city lights blurred, not from tears but from resolve. I didn't know yet if Nathan would fight for us. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never again sit quietly at a table where my worth was on the menu. The following Saturday, the Harrington estate looked exactly as it always had, pristine, untouchable, a fortress of old money perched above Napa Valley like it owned the horizon. But as I climbed the wide stone steps with Henry Collins's briefcase in my hand, it felt different. For the first time, I wasn't arriving as Nathan's fiancé desperately seeking approval. I was arriving as Alyssa Morgan, a woman who knew her worth. The double doors swung open before I knocked. Margaret Harrington stood framed in the doorway, her pearls gleaming like armor. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Well," she said coolly, "the prodigal girl returns. I wasn't sure we'd see you again after your little outburst." I stepped inside, refusing to flinch at the word. "You'll see me plenty, Margaret. I'm not going anywhere." The great room smelled faintly of leather and aged bourbon. Mr. Harrington sat by the fireplace, his cane resting against the chair, eyes cold and appraising. Nathan stood off to the side, shoulders tense, as if caught between two worlds. I set the briefcase on the glass coffee table. The click of the locks opening echoed louder than any word. "This," I said, sliding the papers out, "is the revised agreement, drafted by Henry Collins. It protects Nathan, yes, but it also protects me. If you want this wedding to happen, these are the terms." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You dare walk into our home and dictate conditions? You think a few scraps of paper give you power here?" I met her stare evenly. "Not scraps. Legal safeguards. And more than that, proof that I won't be bullied into silence." Mr. Harrington leaned forward, voice low and gravelly. "Do you know how many women have sat where you're sitting? Pretty faces, clever tongues, all convinced they could rewrite the rules of this family. None of them lasted." "Maybe none of them fought back," I said. My voice didn't tremble. "But I will. And if you're underestimating me, that's your mistake, not mine." Nathan shifted, finally stepping closer. "Father, Mother, she's not wrong. The way you handled things was cruel. Alyssa deserves respect." "Respect?" Margaret snapped, her pearls rattling as she turned on him. "We raised you to inherit an empire, not to be distracted by a girl who what?" I cut in. "Who built herself up from nothing. Who doesn't come with a silver spoon in her mouth. You're right, I'm not like you. But that's exactly why Nathan needs me." For the first time, Mr. Harrington's expression flickered, something between curiosity and irritation. He studied me the way a chess player studies an unexpected move. "And if we refuse?" he asked quietly. I leaned forward, sliding the final page across the table. "Then I walk. And when I walk, you don't just lose me, you lose Nathan. Because whether you've realized it or not, he's already halfway out the door. He's tired of being your puppet. Tired of carrying the weight of a family name that feels more like chains than legacy." The words hit harder than I expected. Nathan's eyes darted to mine, startled, but he didn't deny it. His silence was confirmation enough. Margaret's hand trembled on her pearls. "You're poisoning him." "No," I said firmly. "I'm freeing him." The room went still. Even the fire seemed to quiet, as if waiting for someone to move. Finally, Mr. Harrington spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You're bold. I'll give you that. Most people bow when they enter this house. You—" He studied me, a hint of grudging respect flickering in his eyes. "You slammed the door open." I didn't blink. "Because I know my worth. And if this family can't see it, then Nathan and I will build something outside these walls. You can keep your empire, but you won't keep me under your thumb." Nathan stepped beside me now, his hand brushing mine, a silent alignment, tentative but real. "She's right," he said. "If you can't accept Alyssa as my equal, then you lose us both." Margaret gasped, as though betrayal had just walked into her parlor. But Mr. Harrington only leaned back, lips pressed into a hard line. "This conversation isn't over," he said. "Good," I replied, "because neither am I." I gathered the papers back into the briefcase, snapping it shut with a decisive click. Then I stood, Nathan at my side, and for the first time since stepping into that house, I felt taller than every portrait hanging on the walls. We walked out together, past Margaret's icy glare and Mr. Harrington's calculating silence. The heavy doors closed behind us with a thud that felt less like an ending and more like the start of war. The morning of our wedding dawned clear, but my chest felt anything but light. The Harrington estate had been transformed overnight into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. White roses cascading down the marble stairs, golden ribbons catching the breeze, a string quartet rehearsing quietly in the garden. I should have felt like a princess. Instead, I felt like a soldier about to step onto a battlefield dressed in lace. In the bridal suite, I stood before the mirror in a gown I'd chosen myself, not one Margaret had approved. Its simple lines and satin train weren't about impressing anyone. It was about me, about standing in my truth. Sophia, my oldest friend, adjusted the veil on my hair. "You look unstoppable," she whispered, her eyes glistening. I let out a shaky laugh. "Let's hope so. I don't think Margaret's here for the vows. She's here to see if I falter." Sophia squeezed my hand. "Then don't give her the satisfaction." The ceremony was set under the Harringtons' ancient oak tree, the one they said had watched over 3 generations of weddings. Rows of white chairs stretched across the lawn, filled with people whose eyes weighed heavy on me. Some whispered, some smiled too politely. And then there was Margaret, seated front row, posture rigid, lips pressed thin as if the sunlight itself offended her. Beside her, Mr. Harrington leaned on his cane, watching with unreadable eyes. I locked onto Nathan instead. He stood at the altar, looking both nervous and determined. When our eyes met, the tension in my chest eased. The minister's voice blended with the soft rustle of leaves until it was time to speak the words that would bind us. "I, Nathan Harrington," he began, voice steady, "take you, Alyssa Morgan, as my partner, my equal, my love." The word equal made Margaret stiffen visibly. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Nathan didn't falter. He looked straight at me, and in that moment, I knew he wasn't just speaking to me, he was declaring it to them. When it was my turn, my throat tightened. My hands trembled as I held his, but I didn't lower my voice. "I, Alyssa Morgan, take you, Nathan, not because of your family name, but despite it. I choose you, not their empire, not their approval, just you. And I vow never to let fear or pride dictate our love." A sharp intake of breath came from Margaret's row. It was as though the air had been pierced by a blade. The minister asked if anyone had reason these two should not be wed. My heart stopped. This was the moment. Would Margaret rise, object, try to stop us in front of everyone? Her fingers twitched against her pearls. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Mr. Harrington laid a firm hand on hers. Their eyes met, a silent war passing between them. Then, slowly, she pressed her lips shut. It felt like an entire storm had been swallowed whole. "You may kiss the bride," the minister said at last. When Nathan's lips met mine, it wasn't gentle, it was defiant. The crowd erupted in applause, though I could still feel the Harringtons' icy glares. For once, it didn't matter. We had won the moment. At the reception, champagne flowed, music lifted the air, but the tension lingered beneath the glitter. As Nathan and I swayed through our first dance, he whispered in my ear, "We did it. Together." I smiled against his shoulder. "Yes, but this is just the beginning. They won't stop testing us." He pulled back enough to meet my eyes, the flicker of determination returning. "Then let them try. I chose you. I'll choose you again, every day." From across the room, Margaret's gaze burned like a warning flame. Yet for the first time, I didn't shrink under it. I held my head high, Nathan's hand in mine, and let the music carry us. Because no matter how carefully they'd staged this wedding to showcase the Harrington legacy, everyone in attendance had witnessed something they couldn't erase. This wasn't their victory. It was mine. The morning after the wedding, sunlight poured into the suite Nathan and I had been given at the Harrington estate. The silk curtains fluttered, the champagne glasses from last night still sat half empty on the dresser. I should have woken up with nothing but joy. Instead, a knot of unease twisted in my stomach. Nathan lay beside me, still asleep, his arm draped across my waist. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to imagine a quiet life, just the two of us, no Margaret's piercing gaze, no whispers of contracts or inheritances, just love. But the knock on the door shattered that illusion. A servant entered quietly. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, hesitating slightly over my new title. "Mrs. Harrington requests your presence in the study." Margaret. Of course, she wouldn't waste time. I slipped into a cream dress and followed the winding hallway down to the study. Margaret was waiting, seated behind a mahogany desk that seemed more like a throne than a piece of furniture. The blinds were drawn, casting sharp stripes of light across her face. "Sit," she commanded, not offering tea or even a smile. I sat, folding my hands in my lap, bracing myself. Her eyes scanned me, deliberate, cold. "Yesterday was a spectacle. Congratulations. But don't mistake a ceremony for acceptance." "I'm not asking for your acceptance," I replied, keeping my voice steady though my heart pounded. "I married Nathan, not your approval." A flicker of irritation crossed her face, quickly masked. She leaned forward. "Then let's speak plainly. The Harrington name carries weight, Alyssa. Expectations. You may have captured Nathan's heart, but do not fool yourself into thinking you control his future. That future belongs to this family." My chest tightened. If by family you mean you, then no. Nathan decides his own future. So do I. Margaret's lips curved into a smile, but it wasn't kind. It was the smile of someone who knew secrets I didn't. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, financial ledgers, property deeds, contracts. My pulse quickened as I scanned the pages. Then I saw it. My father's name. I froze. "What is this?" Margaret's eyes gleamed. "Your father, Richard Morgan, owed the Harringtons a debt, a large one, decades old. We paid it off. That is why you grew up in a house you didn't lose, why your family survived when they should have drowned in bankruptcy." My breath caught. Memories of my father's late nights at the kitchen table, the hushed arguments about money, the sudden, unexplained reprieve when things seemed to miraculously improve. It all clicked. "You're lying," I whispered, though deep down I knew she wasn't. "Believe what you will," she said smoothly. "But understand this. Your marriage isn't just about love. It's about balance. You owe us, whether you admit it or not." I stumbled out of the study, folder clutched in trembling hands. Nathan found me in the hall. "Alyssa, what happened?" I shoved the papers against his chest. "Did you know about this? About my father?" His eyes widened as he skimmed the documents. No. Alyssa, I swear I didn't." "Then why would she have them? Why bring it up now?" My voice cracked, torn between anger and fear. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. "Because she'll use anything she can to manipulate us. That's what she does. But we can face this. Together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted his words to wash away the dread clawing at me. But the truth was, the Harringtons had already sunk their claws into my life long before I walked down that aisle. That night, I stood by the window of our suite, looking out over the estate. The celebration lights from the wedding were still strung across the garden, but now they looked more like a cage than a decoration. Nathan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "Don't let her get into your head," he murmured. "We'll figure this out." I turned to face him, searching his eyes. "What if it's not just in my head, Nathan? What if my whole life has been tied to your family without me even knowing it?" He pulled me close, but I felt the weight of the truth pressing between us, heavy and unspoken. Because one thing was clear, marrying Nathan didn't free me from the Harringtons. It bound me to them. The days following the revelation about my father's debt were heavy with silence. Nathan tried to comfort me, but every touch carried the weight of unspoken questions. I wandered through the Harrington estate like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, wondering if this marriage had been my choice, or if I had been maneuvered into it all along. One evening, as the last traces of sunset bled into the sky, I found myself standing again in Margaret's study, the very room where she'd shattered my illusions. Only this time, I wasn't trembling. She looked up from her papers, her face composed, her eyes sharp. "Alyssa," she said, her tone calm but edged. "I assume you've come to your senses." I closed the door behind me and stepped forward. "No, I've come to tell you something." Margaret's brow arched. "Go on." I met her gaze, unflinching. "You may have rescued my family decades ago, but you don't own me. You don't own Nathan, and you will not dictate the terms of our life." Her smile was thin, practiced. "You're young, naive. You don't understand how the world works." "Maybe not," I admitted, "but I understand this. Control only lasts if people allow it, and I won't. Not anymore." For the first time, Margaret's composure faltered. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again, as if she wasn't sure whether to laugh or lash out. But I didn't give her the chance. I placed the folder she had shown me, the debts, the contracts, on her desk. "Keep it. It no longer defines me. My father's mistakes aren't my chains, and your power over Nathan ends the moment he and I stand together." Behind me, I heard a voice. "She's right." Nathan had entered quietly, his presence filling the room. He walked to my side, taking my hand in his eyes locked on his mother's. "I love you, Mother. But Alyssa is my wife, my partner. If you can't respect that, then you'll lose both of us." The silence that followed was sharp, tense. Margaret's eyes flicked between us, as though calculating the cost of pressing further. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her voice softer, almost weary. "Perhaps," she murmured, "you're stronger than I thought." It wasn't an apology, not even close, but it was the closest thing to surrender I'd ever expect from her. Nathan squeezed my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. We left the study together, the door clicking shut behind us. That night, lying in bed, I realized the Harringtons hadn't been defeated. Not really. Margaret would always be who she was, but I had changed. I had found my voice. And that, I knew, was stronger than any contract, any threat, any whispered manipulation. The cage I'd feared was never the Harrington estate. It was my own silence. And now, finally, I had broken free. Life rarely unfolds the way we dream it. I thought marriage would be the happy ending, the neat bow that tied every struggle into a beautiful package. Instead, it was the beginning of a harder truth. Love doesn't protect you from betrayal, from power games, or from old debts resurfacing to haunt your present. But it does give you a choice, whether to shrink in fear or to stand tall and claim your place. I learned that no matter where we come from, we are not bound by the shadows of our parents' mistakes or the chains of someone else's control. What defines us is the courage to speak, to resist, and to love without losing ourselves. If you've ever felt trapped by family expectations, by fear of disapproval, by the weight of secrets, you are not alone. The world will try to write your story for you, but the pen is still in your hand. So choose yourself. Choose your voice. Choose to be free. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what lesson did you take away from Alyssa's journey? I'd love to hear your story too.